Michael, if somebody decides to go through a Chapter 7, which is a complete elimination of their debt, are they automatically going to lose their home?
It's amazing how few things are automatic in bankruptcy. So what you have to look at is not only the house value, but you also have to look at how much the mortgage liens are against the value of the house. And so if there's very little equity available, very little cash to be realized if that house were sold, then they don't automatically lose the house. In Chapter 7, the trustee has the option of trying to sell property, but they have to be able to justify it as something that's going to result in money to creditors. And so it certainly is not automatic. And in fact, with many houses going down in value these days, very, very few houses are being sold in Chapter 7 these days. Mm-hmm. In fact, almost none.
How's that? Now, real estate obviously is one of the probably the most valuable asset that most people own these days. Have you ever run into a situation where somebody had some real property and they knew they were going to bankruptcy and they didn't want this real property to be pulled into that bankruptcy? So they transfer it out of their ownership before they file bankruptcy. What happens in those situations?
The idea is that if the house was transferred just to hide that asset from everybody, that transfer can be undone for up to 4 years. And the idea is that whatever money was transferred out of the bankruptcy estate can be brought back in and then paid out to creditors.
I see. If there's this transfer and the fraudulent transfer prior to the bankruptcy, that
correct,
can be pulled back in. All right.
But, I mean, it's all based on numbers. It's not so much trying to figure out why they transferred it. It's just a question of how much money was left over essentially in their assets after they transferred the property. So if all of a sudden they had a whole lot of debt and no assets anymore, then that's when the transfer can be undone. But then there are also other types of transfers where, say, a parent is getting up in years and they want to transfer something to their kids and make sure that the house is still owned by one of the kids after the parent dies. That's another type of transfer that the mortgage company didn't necessarily go along with. And so those sorts of transfers also affect whether someone can do bankruptcy or not, such as if the parent dies and then the child wants to try and save the house possibly from a foreclosure. Mm-hmm. There's some tests that we have to use to decide whether they could actually do that. However, if the mortgage isn't in their name, it's a lot harder to force that mortgage company to accept the payments in the bankruptcy.
Okay. Tina, if somebody decides that they have to go through a bankruptcy, but there's certain debts they don't want to have discharged in bankruptcy. Is that possible?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me just say that an individual has to put down all their debts. They cannot pick and choose which creditors they're going to pay. Everybody they owe has to come into the bankruptcy estate. Mm-hmm. However, they can do what's called a reaffirmation agreement with that creditor and continue making the payments. And that then will not be discharged in the bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. And also, they will be liable for it. So if they run into trouble later, they'll still have to pay for that. The bankruptcy won't help them in that way.
I see. So once they do that, they're stuck with that debt.
Pretty much, yeah. And people do reaffirm mortgages. Sometimes they reaffirm debts to protect co-debtors, people, joint debts. So.
Okay. And then if you take your classic Chapter 7, where there's a complete liquidation of the assets and the debt, if the debt is not reaffirmed, if it's the Chapter 7 they reaffirmed it, then they continue to own the debt. But if they do not reaffirm the debt, then
the debt is discharged.
Discharge.
Yeah.
Okay.
In some cases, such as mortgages, though, if they don't reaffirm the debt is discharged, but they have to continue making their mortgage payments if they want to stay in the house, because the creditor can retake the property if they don't make the payments.